If you've ever turned off the lights, locked the doors, got under a blanket, and spent hours watching a documentary about a serial killer, then this episode is for you. Today is all about true crime, the nonfiction genre that explores victims of crimes and looks at the motives of the people who committed them. Now, there is no shortage of examples of these types of programs. Here are just a few. Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes. The Family Next Door, The Menendez Brothers, Gone Girls, The Long Island Serial Killer, Worst Roommate Ever, The Ripper, Meet Mary Murder, American Manhunt, O.J. Simpson, Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile. So why are these shows so popular, and what effects can they have on our brain and our behavior? We're gonna find out. Now, please note, this episode will include discussions of murder and violence, so if you're sensitive to these topics, you may want to stop watching now. I'm William Lee Adams, and this is What in the World from the BBC World Service. Here to tell us more about the topic is Jacqui Wakefield from the BBC's Global Disinformation Unit. Jacqui, hi.
Hi.
So Jacqui, let's zoom out for a minute. What do we mean when we say true crime?
So true crime is any content that follows the real aspects of any crime case, whether that be a murder, a kidnapping, a serial killer, even something like shoplifting would be true crime. So it's something that looks at the legal aspects, the putting together the journalistic aspects of the case, and looking at who did it.
And why do you think they're so popular?
I think there's so many reasons, right? I think one is that there's this discussion aspect to it. We can chat about it. You can hypothesize. It means that you kind of build a bit of involvement with the story with mates or with people online. And then I think there's also this idea of getting justice that I think people are really fascinated by. This idea of why did someone do something and can we hold them to account for that?
And I've always been obsessed with this idea that I'm going to be kidnapped. I think it goes back to when I was a kid and the teachers were like, if you leave the playground, a spooky man in a slow-moving car will open the door and snatch you. So I sort of watch these shows to find out tips about what I can do if I'm in one of these situations. And I want to give you an example. There's a show called Surviving Evil. And in one episode, a woman's kidnapped and she's beaten and she's put in a trash bin upside down. Now, at the end of the episode, she survives evil. And she says that her great lesson was that she needed to flip herself over, aka knock the trash bin over, so that she wouldn't die, so that she would remain conscious. And she did. And she survived evil. Now, do you ever draw lessons, life lessons like that from these shows?
I think that's one thing that me, myself, and I think audiences really get from true crime. I don't know about you, but I know when I'm scrolling on my own TikTok, I always watch those videos where it's like, this is how to escape from a car boot if you're stuck in there. Like you punch through the light glass and then you wave. Why do I watch these things? I think it's similar to you, right? We're kind of told about this risk of kidnapping and I mean, true crime is part of that. We're so exposed to these risks that are so unlikely to happen. So I do think there is like an aspect of what not to do. And I think that explains why true crime is so popular with women, because women are kind of told about these, you know, you're not going to be safe at night, not going to be safe on the streets. And I think a lot of women like justify loving true crime so much because it kind of gives you step to step of what not to do.
Do you ever find these shows calming? For instance, life is really messy, and when I watch these shows, I somehow feel better about my own station. The problems that I have don't seem so bad because it could always be worse.
Definitely. I mean, I used to fall asleep to true crime podcasts. I think part of it is the people that tend to present them have extremely calming, beautiful voices. So that's one aspect. Separately to that, I think there's something very formulaic to these programs that we really enjoy. I really enjoy in particular. It's that idea of, you know, slowly picking through every detail, finding out every aspect about a case, and then sometimes wrapping it up in the end with an answer that we so rarely get in real life.
Absolutely. There's some gratification there. Now, I want to pause for a moment and bring in Dr. Julia Shaw. She is a psychologist here in London, and she hosts the BBC true crime podcast, Bad People. We had a conversation earlier about some of the reasons people like the true crime genre.
I think that true crime fans get a bit of a bad reputation, as in I think that people stereotype themselves a bit, where there's this idea that true crime is this dark, almost dirty little secret that people have, and that they shouldn't enjoy watching shows about things like murder. But I think what's actually going on is a profound psychological interest in why people do bad things. And so it's one thing to engage with dramas or with fiction and to enjoy interesting stories and interesting crimes, but it's something completely different to try and really understand the minds and motives of people who kill, for example. And so I think it's not this shallow, vapid pastime that true crime is often presented as. I think instead it's actually people who want to really deal with the things that are most important in society. And so, it's the wider questions that we can draw from individual issues, individual cases, and what they mean for society and how we talk about one another. I also think that, at least based on our listeners, that people really want to understand their own dark thoughts. And so we all sometimes, for example, have murder fantasies. So occasionally, or at least according to research, there's been studies which have shown that people have in their lives at some point fantasized about killing somebody. And I don't mean that in a sort of really detailed way. I mean more that someone is really bugging you and you have this fleeting thought, perhaps, of what would happen if. And of course, the benefit of that is that you're sort of going through this thought experiment, and hopefully it should help you to make a decision not to do that because you're thinking about the negative consequences that also follow. But those dark impulses that we all have, those thoughts, I think people really want to understand them. And when you see the manifestation of those thoughts in the most extreme form in crime, you can deal with them, but in a more, I don't know, in an easier way than just trying to introspect.
So, Jacqui, we talked about the why people like these programs, but when did they become so popular?
True crime has always been popular. There were, articles in the 18th century that was about true crime. In the 80s and 90s, there were lots of serial killer true crime documentaries. But it really exploded on the scene with Serial, which is a podcast from the New York Times, which followed the case of Adnan Syed. This was where the idea of true crime really entered the mainstream. This podcast went, I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it went crazy, and it really had real world implications as well. Adnan Syed, who was accused of the murder of Heyman Lee, was actually just released after the podcast came out due to evidence that came out within the podcast. And I think it really captured people because there was this weekly format. People were discussing it in forums, and it just took on a life of its own. Serial came out in 2014, and in the decades since, we've seen an explosion of true crime podcasts, but also more and more documentaries and online content as well.
Yeah, and the internet, of course, sustains interest in these programs. Could you tell us about the role the internet plays in sort of hyping these shows and creating communities around them?
Yeah, so the internet's always ever since the internet started, it's played a bit of a role in these cases. So in 1999, there was a website called Web Sleuths where people would log on and discuss different cases. Of course, this was pretty small scale. It was before social media. It was just a few people who were very, very into this world. Then you have Reddit, where people were discussing it on forums. It got a little bit bigger. And it wasn't until the advent of algorithmic social media, so, TikTok, Instagram, and others, where it was really hard to avoid, and you started getting people really building upon each other to create a frenzy. And we've really seen it affect real life cases, sometimes in positive ways, but more often in negative ways. So one example is the Gabby Petito case. So Gabby Petito was a young woman. She was 22. She was on a van trip with her boyfriend, Brian Laundrie, and she went missing on the van trip, and it came out about a couple of weeks after her murder that her boyfriend, Brian Laundrie, had committed the murder. He then took his own life. There was so many TikTok creators jumping on that trend and making videos after videos. And one of the creators themselves said, one of the benefits to me creating and not being a journalistic organization is I am allowed to say whatever I want. It doesn't have to be fact. It can be conjecture, which is entertaining to be discussing things with your followers. But then you kind of go into the space of some wrong people were accused. You also had the aspect of these social media sleuths were throwing out locations that Gabby had never been to. But then you have some actually helping. So through social media, there was a couple that was also on a van trip similar to Gabby Petito. And they actually had camera footage of the van a few days before she went missing. So it really is it's a double-edged sword. It can sometimes be positive, but more often than not, it can be negative. I think it's very easy to forget when you're watching a TV show or listening to a podcast that these are real people that, let's say that in these particular cases, the victim did pass away, and you forget that their family's still around. They are often hearing what people are saying about them. They're hearing these theories, and that's where treating it as entertainment can get really tough, and a lot of true crime content can kind of teeter into that space where it can be disrespectful and not really taking the case seriously.
And Jacqui, the negative consequences can extend to the viewers as well. For instance, if I'm watching a show and the serial killer drives a white van and is very handsome, I then become suspicious in the real world when I see a white van. And I actually spoke to Dr. Julia Shaw about this. Here's more of our conversation about the negative impact on viewers.
This is a question I get asked for myself as well. How are you not constantly suffering from what's called vicarious trauma, which is when you experience somebody else's trauma and basically through empathy carry it yourself as well and have your own flashbacks? And the answer is sometimes I do have flashbacks. And I think with true crime shows, that is a possibility, especially with the frontline cameras that we now have. We're now getting footage, like body-worn camera footage and HD camera footage from Nest cams, doorbell cams. And so that is completely changing where you are in relation to the crime. And that certainly I've felt, and there's been some research on this as well with other emergency responders, that has a much more severe impact on us psychologically because you are right in somebody's face. You are in the middle of this crime in a way that used to be quite grainy and removed. But if you are effectively breathing with the person as they're being killed, that is a completely different experience. And so that is where I think we do need to be careful, both in how things are cut and as consumers of true crime, take breaks, especially if things are intense. But we need to not overblow this idea that this is something that's going to happen to everyone. And actually the crime that I'm most worried about, the fear mongering of, that I also see well-meaning people do, is the fear of sexual assault of women. And I think if you constantly hear narratives and true cases of women getting sexually assaulted, I think the problem is that it can make women like myself feel like I shouldn't go outside. And it really limits our psychological freedom of movement. And that is a catastrophic outcome, and it's often wrong. Even though it is a prevalent thing that happens, it is not something that happens very often to most people, right? Or luckily to some people, never at all.
Jacqui, let's pivot back to the positives of true crime. Are there any examples where these shows have led to solutions or helped investigators?
Yeah, so there's a lot of cases where these podcasts really reinvigorate interest in cold cases and end in a conclusion and end in a sentencing. So, for example, there's this podcast in Australia that looked at a cold case of a woman who had been killed, and this podcast was able to piece together evidence around the case, and it completely went viral, at least in Australia. I think it was pretty global as well. And it turned out that the husband at the time had murdered the wife, and the podcast was what helped piece together evidence, reinvigorate interest, which resulted in a court case and then a sentencing.
Jacqui, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you so much.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching another episode of What in the World from the BBC World Service. If you enjoyed this video, please do give us a like, and why not join the over 1 million people who already subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube account. I'm William Lee Adams. This is What in the World, and we'll see you again soon.